Hi, everybody. Welcome back to All Things Nerdy, episode 10. Today we have a very special episode, May the 4th. So we're going to be talking about Star Wars and the Force. It's a very common saying, May the 4th be with you. So we are super stoked. And I know Star Wars has like one of the biggest, fandoms and fan communities out there. And it's only growing with Disney taking over and stuff. But today we have a very special guest who's been a fan since the very beginning. So excited to talk with you and any guests and comments we might have. As always, I am Nate. That is Joe, and excited.
Yep, super excited for today. But without further ado, Corbin, talk nerdy to us.
I'm happy to do that. My name is Corbin Wagner, and I have been a Star Wars fan since 1977, in a time long, long ago in a theater far, far away. First time I saw Star Wars, of course, I was just a kid, um, and it just immediately drew me in. I think, as a kid, we didn't get the deeper meaning behind some of the things in the movies. The whole There's a galactic civil war going on. All we saw was there were cool creatures, cool spaceships, and space wizards with laser swords, and that was the coolest thing ever to me as a kid. Of course, a lot of people that saw those movies back then, they grew out of that. Um, I never did, and a lot of my friends never did. We still love it. We're still all about the adventure and the cool ideas that can come out of that franchise. So,
That's super awesome. We got a good afternoon from Fritzen. So good afternoon to you, sir, too, sir. But you just said that, you were with it from the beginning, right? So like the first movie that ever come out, like based on that, what is like the earliest memory of Star Wars, and like how does that memory like make you feel when you kind of think about it?
I remember, well, not just seeing the movie, but also um, all the toys and all the things that came out, all the merchandise that they put out for that. And I very distinctly remember um, pulling some of those figurines out of the packages and just sitting out in the dirt and playing with them when I was, 8 or 9 years old. And I really wish that now that I hadn't pulled them out of the packages because they were
That's what I was
probably
about to say. The
worth a
collector
lot
in
of
me
money.
like hurts a little bit when you talk about it. I'm like,
Hmm.
oh God, you regret that.
So, but nobody knew. I mean, nobody knew what it was going to do and how big it was actually going to get. And I think it's fascinating to me and a little amusing actually that it has grown to be such a part of our popular culture.
Yeah.
It's almost like a cool thing to be a Star Wars person now, right? Like it's such a big like hip thing. Disney taking it in, Lucasfilms, all that. Like to to claim that you're a Star Wars fan is no longer like a weird thing. Like back, so first off, the movies back in the day were so far ahead of their time. The things they did, like in the sci-fi genre, pushed the envelope so far. That's why the original trilogy was so good. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Some of the special effects and some of the just the core concepts of it were very new at the time and were just innovative and they were amazing. George Lucas, if nothing else, he was a visionary. I mean, he had this vision, this vast galactic civilization that just was not something that we were used to seeing on screen. And making that come to life, having the visual effects that they used, they had to create new techniques, they had to create new things just to bring that to life the way they did. And of course, nowadays it's CGI, it's all these things that have grown up out of that from that time period. We look back and we think, well, that's kind of lame looking. It's kind of shoddy looking. But at the time, it was just cutting edge. It was amazing.
Yeah.
So
And, you know, I have opinions about George Lucas, but I have to admit that he really did push us forward when it comes to special effects and the way that movies were made. The idea of a franchise, even
yep.
where you have multiple movies that all tie into that same universe, that same setting, was not a thing, and he actually kind of created that with Star Wars.
That's really cool.
So one of my favorite things I've ever seen. I don't remember what I watched it on. It was probably TV when I was a little kid, and it was a show talking about the special effects. And I'll never forget the cars that hover, right, and things like that. So the way they got rid of the wheels is they actually put Vaseline on the camera lens. And I'm just like, now it's all CGI. You don't need to do that. But back then, like, no one had really thought about it. And, like, they did it so well. So you watch it and you're like, oh, my God, like, there's just Vaseline making this happen.
That's really cool.
Yeah, they also used mirrors, too. That was another interesting thing that for the land speeder that Luke had on Tatooine, they put mirrors over the wheels all along the bottom of that. And it reflected the ground so well that it just it blurred together and made it look like it was floating. So it was practical effects plus the camera work. A lot went into that, and it was really just so inventive the way they did things.
Yeah. And I agree with you. I do think it pushed sci-fi further, right? Because it pushed the envelope and it set a standard and expectation for things to follow. So like it was a pioneer in that.
I would say I didn't like get into Star Wars till like 2018. So I went back and of course watched the movie, and I was like, the movie was made in what, 1977, somewhere around there. I was like, all right, let me put my goggles on of like, this movie was made in 1977. That way I didn't get my expectations too high on the, like, the visual effects, stuff like that. But like, I was blown away. Like, I would think like maybe that movie was made in 1990s, like 95, something like that. But to think it was made in the 70s where they had to do that type of stuff, they didn't have the visual effects and stuff like that. I was just like, that's what caught me, was like how like in advance they were for that time.
Absolutely, and the model making and the puppetry and things like that went into that, it was just really impressive. And I just can't say enough about the not using CGI, um, because Lucas really wanted the world to look lived in. He wanted it to look like people actually existed in that world, and to achieve that, he kind of stepped away from what sci-fi was previous to that, because most of the sci-fi that you see from that era, from the 50s, 60s up into the 70s, they had this vision of the future where everything was shiny, everything was like gold lame, and it was just chrome, and it was very clean and kind of not realistic. And what George did was he wanted the world to be rough. He wanted it to look like people used their machines and their vehicles and their and just wanted everything to look like you could relate to it as having lived there. And so a lot of the ships were dirty looking. They were kind of clunky. They disrepair, things like that. And it just was such a step forward in making it immersive, I think, for the audience compared to some of the stuff that had come before it. So
I think one of my hardest thing, like to wrap my head around, is all the different like species and aliens and stuff like that. Like, how creative do you have to be like, look at all these different things? I think that's really cool in what they did, because it wasn't just your traditional aliens. Like, they were intelligent, but they were all different forms and all that stuff.
We actually just got a question, and it's a controversial question apparently. Here we go. Jeremy Cox, controversial question. What is the right order to watch the movies?
If you do a search online, there's something called the machete cut, which is pretty good. I don't remember the exact order of that. I'd actually have to look that up, because of course, coming from having watched the three original ones, when they first came out, it's hard for me to see it any other way than the original three, and then the prequels, and then all of the material that's come out since that. But I would honestly just skip the Phantom Menace altogether. I just would not watch that one at all. I hate to say it, but you just don't need that to get the story, and it's probably one of the worst ones as far as writing. And but if you want to watch it, if you have to watch all of them, I would watch the original A New Hope first, and then do maybe some of the backstory in the Attack of the Clones, and go from there. Because, but the Machete Order, if you do look that up on Google, that does give you kind of a good order to watch them in. Again, I don't remember it exactly, but they talk about watching the original and then going back to see Anakin's backstory, and then coming forward to see kind of the way the Empire had shaped itself from that. But also, you have a lot of animated features now, a lot of animated series that talk about the time in between the prequels and the originals. And I think that some of those are really fantastic for just seeing that in between time, in between the movies. And you get a lot of story, you get a lot of character development, and see a lot more kind of how Anakin was shaped throughout that time period to become Vader. And it's a lot of really interesting characters that come up in those animated series that you just don't see in the movies. So
Right.
you really need to include those if you want to be thorough about it. I hope that sort of answered the question. Probably not really. Sorry.
No, that did. We did have a comment that says, no, don't skip Phantom Menace because you'll miss Darth Maul and Liam Neeson.
That's true. I mean, I will give that Darth Maul was actually one of the best things to come out of that movie. And his story doesn't actually end at the end of the Phantom Menace. And it just, there's a very large story arc that Darth Maul carries through a lot of the media that came out after that. And so people see there's an end scene in Solo, the Han Solo backstory, where Darth Maul shows up as a hologram, and people were freaked out. They're like, "What? Didn't he die?" No, he really didn't. He actually survived that fight in the Phantom Menace, and came back and was very involved and integral in some of the Clone Wars stories. So I highly recommend that if you have not seen either the Clone Wars or Rebels, those animated series, that you do so, because they're really good.
Okay, awesome. And we actually just got another question as well. So from Keaton Treadwell, what's your favorite live action Star Wars show?
Are you talking about series or movie?
I'd say show, because he said show, so series.
Series.
Yeah.
Hang on. Sorry, my voice is really going. As far as live action, I really think The Mandalorian so far has been the best. I wasn't too impressed with the Boba Fett series. It was decent, but it wasn't the best. I really liked what they did with The Mandalorian, where they made it more kind of that Western kind of feel, where he's the lone bounty hunter. But Dave Filoni was part of the team that did the Clone Wars and the Rebels cartoon, and he brought a lot of that in to there we go. He brought a lot of that into the series when he did the live action, and in the third season of The Mandalorian, you're seeing a more broader scope of the storytelling from just the Mandalorian by himself, Din Djarin being the main character, but it still holds together really well. So I'd have to say The Mandalorian is probably the best one they've done.
Okay.
I'm
I have
really
the shirt, so I would agree.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm really looking forward, though, to the Ahsoka series that's coming out in August.
Yeah.
That's kind of a continuation of the Rebels storyline. How much of that he's going to bring in, I don't know, but Ahsoka is one of the better characters to come out of the Clone Wars, and just really excited to see the live action version of some of those characters.
Yeah, I'm stoked for that too. I saw the preview and I was like, oh, this is gonna be good.
So we covered your favorite series. What about your favorite movie?
Oh, that's hands down The Empire Strikes Back. I even got the shirt. It's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Empire was one of the best written, one of the best conceived, and just the fact that it it didn't let the good guys just walk over everybody. That was the movie where you really saw how dangerous and how powerful the Empire really was, and just set it up so that you understood kind of what these heroes were up against, and seeing the setbacks that they suffered in that movie was very impactful, I thought.
Okay. And Keaton actually threw up another question. Thoughts on Andor?
Andor was Rogue One was one of those movies where did we really need that story told? Maybe, maybe not. But I'm a big fan of Rogue One, and I like what they did with it. And the Andor story, kind of seeing his backstory, and how the rebellion kind of shaped up through that time period, I thought it was extremely well done. The characterizations, all that. I mean, that's probably my second favorite of the live action. Um, it's just such a different tone from some of the rest of Star Wars. Like I said, The Mandalorian really is kind of my favorite so far, but Andor took it in a direction that I thought was really good. Um, and it's a much more serious, much darker, grimmer kind of a story. But I think that's what's so great about Star Wars is that there's room for that. There's room for the dark, gritty stories, the war stories, or the stories about espionage that you see in Rogue One. But you also have room for the kids' movies, the cartoons that are designed for the 5 to 10 age. All of that fits in Star Wars, and I think that's absolutely great. So
So, how do you feel about the direction of Star Wars in general right now with Disney buying it, taking over, doing all that? How do you feel about the direction that it's going?
I think it's hit or miss in some ways. Um, you have some really talented, really dedicated people, like Dave Filoni, like John Favreau, um, that are producing some really awesome content. And then you have some that aren't so good. Ryan Johnson never needs to be involved in Star Wars again, ever. Uh, and I'm going to be a little opinionated about that. um, the Last Jedi really kind of killed the sequels. I thought that The Force Awakens was great, um, even though it was kind of a repetition of A New Hope. It was different enough, and the characters there was some chemistry there that I thought was really good. And then you brought in somebody that just did not understand Star Wars. He just didn't get kind of the tone and the expectations of Star Wars, and he was trying really hard to kind of go against those expectations in a way, and it just didn't work. So the last Jedi was kind of a disappointment to me. I mean, I'll watch it; it's part of Star Wars, um, but it made it so that the final movie in that trilogy had to spend so much time kind of making up for the Last Jedi that it just it wasn't cohesive, and I thought that was kind of disappointing because there's a lot of potential there. They could have told a really good story with that, and they didn't. So I'm much more excited about the TV series, and kind of seeing where they go with the Mandalorian and with Ahsoka. So it's really, like I said, it's kind of hit or miss, as far as how Disney has handled all that. I was also a little bit disappointed that they took all of the books, the novels that had been written, through like the 80s and 90s, even up into the early 2000s, and decided that those were not canon anymore, that those were Star Wars legends, that they weren't really part of the actual story that Disney wanted to tell.
Yeah, and I will say, like the Star Wars fan base and stuff like that. I relate them a lot to like comic book fan bases, because if you make a movie about comic books, people constantly like, that doesn't follow comics, that doesn't follow comics, you're getting out of line here or there and things like that. So when Disney's starting to go off to the side, or have moved them to legacy versus canon and stuff like that, now they're starting to tell their own stories. I feel like the Star Wars fan base, especially the old heads, the OGs who have watched it from the beginning, it's not going to have the same feel, and it's not going to have the same draw, because it is not the Star Wars universe that we have all grown to love and appreciate.
Yeah, there's definitely that risk that the people producing that content need to be aware. Star Wars has a feel to it. It's got a tone. It's got, I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's just, it's Star Wars when you see it.
Mm-hmm.
And even now that that they're creating like amusement parks out of Star Wars, and so when you walk into Galaxy's Edge in Disneyland or Disney World, you expect it to look a certain way. You expect it to feel a certain way, and if they screw that up, they're going to lose fans. They're going to lose people.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain section of the fan base that's really strongly opposed to anything Disney does, just on principle, that it's not their Star Wars anymore.
This next question actually kind of can build off of that. So Jeremy says, would you ever want to see remakes of the originals?
Not really. I don't think I'd like to see the originals remade. I mean, I could understand if they did, but I think that the prequels and the sequels could definitely stand some revision. If they remade the prequels and retold that story from of Anakin's fall, I think that would be okay. But the originals, no, I don't think I would want to see that.
don't fix it if it ain't broke.
Yeah, I mean, well, they're just so iconic. I mean, these characters and the way they look and the way that they're written are just they've become almost like a modern day mythology. If you look at them in relation to like King Arthur or Robin Hood or some of these, or Odysseus or some of the myths that we grew up with from the Roman or Greek myths, I think that these characters really have become sort of that kind of mythological status. The years and years and years from now, people are still going to be telling these stories about them, or they're going to know who they are, and those names and those characters are just going to be embedded in the mythology of our time. So remaking them would be a little hard.
I think remastering them, right? I think just upping the quality, the color, the smoothness, things like that. I think I would be okay with that. But imagine like if you redid them, remade them, you'd have to recast them. And you can't live up to that, right? Like nobody is going to come close. I wouldn't even put myself out there for something like that, because you were going to be destroyed by the fan base as soon as you accept that role, right? Like I think that would be the toughest thing, is trying to find people to recast in a remake.
Well, that's already happened, actually. I don't remember the actor's name. I'd have to look that up. But they did recast Han Solo for the backstory that they did on him, which was honestly a really good movie. And when I first saw the actor that they had picked to play the young Han Solo, I wasn't for it. He didn't look like him. I just didn't think he was right for it. But I watched the movie. I gave it a chance. And it was almost eerie how he captured the mannerisms of Harrison Ford in that movie. And he did a great job. I mean, the movie was well written. It was fun. It was a heist movie, which again, Star Wars is big enough. It can fit all these different genres into that storyline. And so recasting, Han Solo as a younger version of himself wasn't as big of an issue as I thought it'd be, but the movie did bomb. And I think a lot of that was because, partially because it came out right after The Last Jedi. And so people were angry over The Last Jedi, and they didn't want to go give more money to Marvel, or to Disney, rather.
Yeah, I mean, more recasting for same time period, same movie plot, same character, right? So Han Solo, it was a younger version, and to recast that would be better than to say to recast Luke as Luke in the same time period, in the same story line and stuff like that. Like you
Yeah,
can't see Luke as a different Luke while still being Luke, if that makes
correct.
sense. You know,
Yeah,
like
that's absolutely true. So the originals, I would not touch those just because of that. Now telling different stories, there's been some talk about casting an older Luke Skywalker um, as from the same actor that plays Bucky Barnes, the Winter Soldier in Marvel. Um, because if you look at his face, it's very similar to Mark Hamill's. And so an older version of Luke, kind of in that in between time between the originals and the sequels, you might be able to pull that off. I know in The Mandalorian, they actually de-aged Mark Hamill. That he did the body work, he did the motion capture for the character, and then they CGI'd and de-aged him to look like Luke when he was much younger. But it was the same actor, and so that kind of made a difference. But I think you could get away with some recasting, just not to tell that same story that was A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back and Jedi. I don't think you could do that.
okay. So something we always ask on this podcast is if you're a complete newbie, a complete beginner, right? So like if I wanted to jump into the world of Star Wars, and right now the world of Star Wars, the universe of Star Wars is overwhelming. There's so much out there. Where would you suggest I start?
A lot of that really, it depends on your age. It depends on kind of what you're looking at as far as, are you our age? Are you, a young kid? Are you a teenager? And you're right. There's so much media. There's so much content out there now. I think the live action series are drawing a lot of people in. So Andor, The Mandalorian, those are definitely capturing an audience. If you're a complete newbie, my first instinct is to say watch the originals, but that's just because I did watch the originals when I was a kid. So that might not be the best place for someone that's new nowadays. That's hard for me to envision. It's been so much a part of my life. Um, I would almost have to say maybe The Mandalorian or even the animated series, depending on the age, um, or Andor if it's someone that's really into those kind of dark, more gritty stories. Um, but yeah, that's a hard question to answer because it depends on the person. That what do they like? Are they video gamers? Would they like to maybe jump into Jedi Survivor or Fallen Order? If it's somebody that does a lot of Call of Duty or something like that, there's Star Wars Battlefront, which is really well done, just pure war games. Um, yeah, I mean, a lot of that's going to depend on the person.
Okay.
So having a generic answer for that's going to be really tough.
So basically, just get into it. There's something out there for you. Depending on what you want, just get into it. Give it a shot.
Absolutely.
There's something for everyone, is what it sounds like. If you like this, try this. Like this seems like there's something that can tie into your interest in the Star Wars universe.
Absolutely, and just because it's such a vast world, it's such a vast universe to play in for storytelling. You can almost just talk to a person and say, "Well, what do you like? What are you into?" And from that, say, "Well, there's this thing in Star Wars that relates to that you probably love. Give that a shot."
Who's your favorite character in the Star Wars universe?
It's got to be Vader. It's got to be Darth Vader. He's the whole thing kind of revolves around him from the beginning. I mean, it's really his story that they're telling throughout the originals and the prequels. Um, so he's got to be my favorite. I have a thing for villains. I think a well drawn villain really makes the story, um, and that's where they kind of fell apart. I think in the sequels, that they just didn't really have a strong single villain to center that around. Kylo Ren was not, he just wasn't enough. Sorry. But the story of Anakin and his fall into the dark side really makes Star Wars what it is. And that conflict that you're seeing throughout that story is just, it's the linchpin of the whole thing between the dark and the light side. So I got to go with Vader.
Okay.
Now, controversial question: is Vader a villain or a hero?
He is definitely a villain. I mean, you can redeem him all you want to, but he was actually really scary. I mean, this is a person with so much power, and he did really bad stuff. I mean, there's just no way around it. He was not a nice guy. He just wasn't. By the time he became Vader, the rage and the hate and just, you can say, well, he was consumed by the dark side, but he made those choices. And I think from the very beginning, even in the Phantom Menace, which the acting wasn't great, and I hate to say it, but the child actor that they picked for that was not the best choice. Not his fault. I'm not blaming the actor at all. But even in the Phantom Menace, I think you can see where there were some negative things about Anakin Skywalker, and throughout the prequels, throughout the Clone Wars cartoon, you're seeing that kind of build up, and particularly in like the last season of the Clone Wars cartoon, where it's happening kind of at the same time as Revenge of the Sith. You're seeing that come out more and more. And so by the time he actually dons the suit and becomes Vader, it's really hard to see him as anything but a villain. And yeah, just especially if you know some of the stuff that happened behind the scenes. He was actually plotting the entire time to take over the Empire. I mean, he hated the Emperor. There was so much hate in him, not just for his past, for Anakin's past, but also for the situation that he was in the present as Vader. He hated the Empire. He hated Palpatine. Every time he force choked an Imperial officer, it was that rage of, you made me this. He felt like everyone else was responsible for his fall. It was Palpatine. It was Padme. It was Obi-Wan. It was the Empire itself. He was just so full of hate, and he never blamed himself for any of that. It was never his fault. So I think you really have to call him a villain.
Okay. So the only reason I ask is like there's a big part out there, a big base that, if you look at the prophecy, right, bringing balance and all of that, he was supposed to be the one to fulfill the prophecy, right? And then when he went to the dark side, became Darth Vader, it was lost. It was not going to happen. But when the Emperor was, frying Luke, he chose to kill the Emperor, right? And then a lot of people are saying he is a hero because by doing that, he did bring balance. He did fulfill the prophecy and all that because he chose to kill the Emperor versus Luke.
Okay, I have a rebuttal for that.
I would love to hear it.
Anakin Skywalker was the biggest drama queen in the universe. I mean, everything he did as Anakin or as Vader was about the drama. And I think that at that moment, when he was seeing Luke on the floor being blasted with Force lightning, it wasn't just about saving his son. It wasn't just about redeeming himself. It was about doing the most dramatic thing he could freaking do at that moment. And that was betraying the Emperor. And so I think a lot of that was not just him, coming back to the good side. I think it was him being a drama queen, even then, and saying that, what's the most flashy, dramatic thing I can do to do this, to save my son? and that's why he did what he did. And
So it was self-serving.
I think it was very self-serving even at that point.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. So, like, I've been reading since I knew this was coming up. I've been reading a decent amount, and I thought it was really cool when I went down the rabbit hole of, is Darth Vader a villain or a hero? And I wanted to get your thoughts on it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, like, saving one Jedi doesn't make up for mass murdering the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the lore in some of the earlier writing that's no longer canon, Vader actually would wipe out entire planets if it served his purpose. I mean, Tarkin was the one that ordered Alderaan destroyed, but Vader wasn't any better. I mean, he had gone through and he committed genocide on several occasions to get what he wanted. I mean, there was nothing good about Vader. During the years that he was actually Darth Vader, he lived up to that reputation. He lived up to just being that monster that you never wanted to have to come in contact with or be on the wrong side of.
Yeah.
So I know we're close on time, but I do have one question that builds off of that one. So you told us who your favorite character was, but if you could be any character in the Star Wars universe, who would you be?
Oh, there's so many choices there. Oh my gosh. When we were kids, we would always fight over who got to be Han Solo because he was just the coolest.
That was my first thought. Is I would be Han Solo.
But there's there's a huge variety of characters that don't appear in the mainstream movies. It would be hard for me to pick. Han Solo would be a good one. Obi-Wan, he's a good one. Seeing him in his younger days, especially throughout, again, kind of like the Clone Wars, in that era, Obi-Wan was the beast. I mean, you don't realize just how powerful and how good he was. Yeah, that's a hard choice. I think Han would probably be pretty close to the top there.
Okay. Yeah, I think I would be Han. What about you, Joe?
I don't know. I mean, Yoda lived so much longer than everyone else.
Yoda, you can't pick Yoda.
Why can I pick Yoda? Why can I not pick Yoda?
You gotta pick something else. Yoda's like a cheat code. You can't pick Yoda. That's not fair.
Oh.
I think my close second would be Chewbacca, right? You get to walk around in your birthday suit, you wear a belt, you're super strong, you get to yell at everybody, right? Like, what a life.
Yeah.
Yeah. I go Chewbacca for sure. Well, Corbin, we are a little past time. Want to, be respectful of that. Do you have anything else you want to say or anything you want to add to the podcast?
I do find it really, really interesting and amusing that over the course of the years, the things that were kind of considered nerdy, that were kind of got you picked on in high school, no bitterness there at all, by the way. Have just taken over. I mean, they've really become part of the weave of popular culture nowadays. And Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Dungeons and Dragons, all these nerdy things that people used to be like, oh, that's kind of off in left field, that nobody really understands it or cares about it. And nowadays, it's out there and it's just everywhere. And it is, you're talking billions and billions of dollars just for the Star Wars franchise. And looking back, I can kind of see how that all grew and how it all developed. But I still find it really fascinating and really interesting that being a Star Wars fan, that being a nerd is a lot. Not only is it accepted, but it's almost glorified nowadays.
100%. That's why we get to have a podcast named All Things Nerdy and have people reaching out to us to talk about D&D and board games and all kinds of different things. Like, the stigma behind being a nerd, I don't think is there. It's almost like glorified these days, right? I've actually had some people reach out to me who's like, you're not a nerd. You can't talk, like, you shouldn't be talking about these things and stuff like that. So it's almost like a badge of honor these days to be a nerd and stuff like that to love these things. And I think, you know, Star Wars and all that is part of it. Helped to get there. I play D&D. I think video games is a big part of it. Brought it into everybody's everyday life. And we have some comments. Joe is choosing not to feature right now for some reason. Joe, if we could bring those up. Steven, I appreciate yours, but I'd like to feature Keaton's mostly. Right.
It was back a few minutes ago, so it was like Joe looks like a Yoda. I took that as a compliment, and then Keaton says Joe would be Jar Jar Binks. I was like, I just replied in the chat and said, "Go away."
Well, Corbin, man, we appreciate you. Thanks so much for hopping on here and sharing all of your knowledge and love and passion of Star Wars with us and things like that. And to everybody listening and watching and commenting, we appreciate you hanging out with us and adding to it.
I appreciate the invite. Thank you so much for having me on. And obviously, I can talk about nerd stuff all day. So it was a good opportunity.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Corbin.